I remember Sundays as if they themselves were a person, soft-footed, full of possibility, and dangerously ordinary, so ordinary that the revelation that would one Sunday flip everything felt at first like a trick of light, a crease in the wallpaper you only notice when the sun hits it right. My mother's business smelled of simmering stock and ambition long before anyone said the number out loud, long before the glossy profiles and the photo shoots that caught her in mid-laugh with a ladle in her hand. We were poor in ways that smart people can explain and mercilessly rich in the kind of love that makes you think sacrifice is a currency. You pay gladly, and yet I learned young that love and survival speak different tongues. She started with a recipe scribbled on yellow paper, a broth that tasted like home after years of being the only thing steady when our lives were unsteady, when my father left, when my sister's school fees arrived like storms, when the landlord's knock felt like a countdown. People said it was nostalgia she was bottling, but anyone who had sat at our kitchen table knew it was more than that. The broth held her mother's hands around a wooden spoon, the way she hummed under her breath. The small nothings of a childhood translated into a heat that settled in the chest like forgiveness. She sold it by the pot, then by the jar, then in neat labels with a logo she designed herself because who else would capture the precise curve of our family table? The business grew the same way. Grief grows and hope grows, incrementally, stubbornly, until reporters with shaky, halting voices wanted to know how a woman from a narrow street corner made a product that, in a fiscal press release, was suddenly worth $300 million. The number dazzled people at parties and frightened them in the way big math does when it lands in small hands. Beautiful and unreachable. For us, though, it was first and most of all a thing that rearranged rooms. Our kitchen became a studio, then a lab, then an office tower of taped boxes and staff badges. The jars traveled on pallets and airplanes. My mother's laughter on the phone with potential distributors made me proud in a way that tasted like pennies and toothpaste. But there was always a ledger beneath the glitter, and the ledger had footnotes that smelled faintly of the broth itself, long hours, a supply chain that demanded more of her than weekends and holidays, deals made in sterile rooms where her words were counted and repackaged. So promises inked in signatures she could no longer remember because she was exhausted, because success on paper requires a human being to stand on the bridge and take the wind for the team. Somewhere in that tilt toward success, something domestic, something tender and ordinary, began to erode. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was the small theft of a Sunday afternoon when she said she had to check shipments and a Sunday became a Monday, the way a pattern repeats until you stop recognizing the original design. Broth, once the center of our family rituals, became inventory. Her apron moved from laundromat to packaging plant. She stopped humming. I tried to be proud of the glossy headlines. Mom makes $300 M, but pride has a way of turning down the volume on things that ache. I would watch her at night, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, sitting at the kitchen counter with a spreadsheet open and a half-eaten sandwich beside it, as if the sandwich were an offering to the gods of growth. I learned the sound of her breath in numbers. Broth deprived me. I wrote once in a journal when I was 17. And the phrase felt both childish and perfectly precise. The broth that had fed our family for years had been requisitioned by the market. It had become product, and in becoming product it had become something that kept my mother away from the small daily ministrations that made me feel visible. The preparations of school lunches, the early morning rides to the hospital when my grandmother fell ill, the whispered explanations of things teenagers don't know how to ask out loud. She gave us everything else. The house with the sunroom where she sometimes sat with a magazine and pretended to rest. The trips to the coast we had once only imagined. But she gave us those things from a distance, from a ledger. And the closeness we traded for them felt like an unmarked debt I could not reconcile. The staff told me once awkwardly that Mom had to be on brand and on call. And the words made her a figure on stage instead of my mother at the sink. The broth that marked our story had become an emblem of success that, in a cruel double turn, signified the cost of that success. The slow absence of the woman who had once been the heart of our small domestic universe. So when Sunday arrived with its thin late light and the house felt quiet enough to hear the little noises that betray secrets, appliances settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator, I went looking like a child who knows an attic door will have dust, but believes it might also have treasure. I wasn't expecting an earthquake, only the small comfort of finding something ordinary. A jar, an old logbook, a recipe my mother had written in a trembling script. Instead, I found a box tucked behind a stack of unsold labels in the storage room, the kind of place the company's auditors rarely bothered to open, and inside it were little things that read like a litany of sacrifice. Letters from suppliers that had been ignored, a set of photographs of my mother in a halfway house when she was 19. A folder labeled Family with the names of people she had cut off because the company had demanded clarity about associations and risk. And a sealed envelope with my name on it in a hand that was mine and not mine at the same time. When I opened the letter, my hands shook. It was not just a note. It was a confession and a map. It had written about the choices she'd made, why she accepted an investor who insisted on scaling production in ways that required recipes to be standardized, and in standardization, some of the old improvisations were excised, why she had agreed to a clause that prohibited personal use of product samples, why the early jars of broth we sold at markets were no longer allowed to be given to guests for free. She had described in lines that stopped and started and bled with ink how the business had become a thing that protected us, but also policed us. She apologized for not being at my high school graduation. She apologized for missing my daughter's first recital. Her handwriting trailed off there. So the apology read like a breath. The letter told me that the founders' contracts included a clause referred to in the boardroom as sterile scaling, a phrase that seemed clinical and final, which meant that recipes were to be replicated only within strict parameters and distributed only through channels that could be accounted for. The consequence was that what had made our broth holy, its small imperfections, the way my mother would season to mood and sun and the tenderness of the day, had to be diminished to meet production quotas. Reading those words felt like a betrayal that was also an explanation. She had not abandoned us out of contempt, but out of a belief that the predicted success would buy back what she had lost. The jar in front of me, one of the first she ever sealed, was unmarked and smelled faintly of cloves and the low heat of remembered kitchens. My fingers left greasy prints on the glass. I remembered her making broth in winter, her patience and act of slow healing, the way she would press her hand into my hair and tell me small, absurd stories about the old neighborhood, as if words could stitch the world back together. I realized then that deprived was not the whole story. Broth had been the instrument, but the person wielding it had been bent by forces she had accepted because they seemed like rescue. The Sunday find did not only uncover what had been lost, it revealed the choices she'd made to try to save us. Anger rose up first hot as steam. How could she trade our dinners for board minutes? How could she let the thing that had been our solace become a ledger line? I pictured her in those boardrooms shrinking like an animal trapped. I pictured the investors' handshakes sealing off the small mercies she had once offered freely. But beneath the anger, a heavier and deeper feeling settled, grief. I mourned the mother I had once had, and the mother I might have had if the world hadn't been hungry for her broth. The letter's last page changed everything. She had written a plan. Not a resignation or a dramatic flourish, but a plan simple and human and impossible to read without my throat tightening. She wanted to bring back the old recipe for the family in secret. She wanted to open one small restaurant, no venture capital, no shareholders, where she could cook in front of people again. She wrote about reclaiming Sabbath, a day when no deliveries would be made and no jars packed, when the family would be permitted to come together without the brand between us. She had been saving small amounts of product, she wrote, siphoned as samples that the compliance team had never noticed. She had kept jars labeled in the margin for home. And this was the envelope with my name, containing a key to a small locker at the city's central market, where there were 3 jars for me to have the first spoonful when the time felt right. Sunday had given me the choice, to confront her with the ledger, to ask her to explain why she had let our life be rearranged for a number, to forgive or to keep that grief locked inside. I took the jars home like contraband, like relics, And when I cracked one open, the aroma hit me like an old prayer, warm, simple, and suffused with the geometry of love. I called her. We spoke for hours, not in the clipped tones of shareholder updates, but in the slow portions of silence and children and memory. She told me about the meetings where her cheeks had hurt from smiling, about the nights she had believed she was doing the right thing for us by scaling, and about the quiet terror of thinking the business might fail and take us with it. She admitted, with a voice that trembled, that she had felt herself dividing into two persons. One those other people wanted, the founder who would grow and be studied in case studies, and the one who came home to make broth out of habit and grief and stubborn love. I told her about the small things she had missed, the recital, the doctor visits, and she apologized again and again, sometimes clumsily, sometimes in a way that showed she was learning how to name the ache she had caused. That Sunday did not provide a cinematic reconciliation or a sudden, neat solution. It provided a doorway. The rest would be built brick by patient brick. She promised me weekends, not in platitude but in concrete. No meetings on Saturdays, and Sundays would be reserved for family. She also told me about the clause she had signed, sterile scaling, and how it inhibited personal distribution. The investor had a lot of legal teeth. We both knew the company would not yield overnight to sentimentalities. So we devised a smaller, surer scheme. She would open, without fanfare, a modest supper on one night a week in the sunroom where she had once mended sweaters, serving the broth the way she had always meant it, hot, imperfect, and seasoned to the person across from her. Summer. It would be a place where staff could eat, where neighbors could knock and sit, where the company's PR would have no part. The owner of a nearby artisanal bakery, an old friend, agreed to lend her a few chairs and a battered set of plates. One of her managers, who still believed the company's first values mattered, agreed to cover for her on Thursday nights. We set the first night on a calendar, small and handwriting it in ink that did not have to be approved by lawyers. The supper was not a marketing ploy. It was an act of reclamation. Word spread slowly and happily because true things spread like roots. People came, old neighbors, friends from the food market, one of the auditors who had a soft corner for human error, and they ate and told stories, and in the way stories do when poured over heat, they connected the present to the past. My mother's shoulders, which had been heavy with spreadsheets and the expectation of growth, began to loosen. She cooked for the sake of cooking again, not for the balance sheet. There were fights still, ugly and honest. The board questioned her moonlighting and legal-issued warnings. Some investors whispered about misalignment and brand risk. We argued at the kitchen table about whether she should fight them or find a way to buy back the recipe rights, about whether the family should accept the trappings of wealth if it meant moral compromise. There were nights when she sat alone with a jar of broth and cried, and nights when she laughed so hard the sound startled the neighbors. In time, the company adjusted. Not all investors were kind, and some contracts remained like chains that had to be filed away and negotiated slowly. But the little supper became an emblem of something more durable than money, the possibility of choosing again. Our lives recalibrated into something messier and truer. My resentment did not vanish at once. It softened into an honest, complicated love that recognized the austerity of the choices she had made. I learned to accept that sometimes survival requires a hard ledger, and sometimes survival also requires risk. The risk of losing money to buy back what matters, the risk of appearing foolish to do things that make your heart full rather than your bank full. The broth that deprived me now performed an additional role. It taught me how to forgive. The jars in our home no longer represented absence. They became a map back to presence, literal, sensory proof that my mother could both run a company and be a flawed, loving parent. Years later, when I would tell this to my own children, if I do, and someday I will tell them about that ordinary Sunday whose fine was not only a stash of jars, but a ledger of human choices, and how one small discovery forced us to reckon with what we wanted our lives to mean. I will tell them that money is a terrible measure of a life if it eats the things that make life worth living, and I will tell them that the most radical thing my mother ever did was to cook again for people who needed to be warmed, not investors who needed to be convinced. That Sunday taught us how to name loss and how to build back. And in the end, the broth, simple, shimmering, seasoned with the small mercies of hands and time, flipped everything because it reminded us what we were fighting for. Not the headline of $300 million, but the warmth of a table where we could belong to each other again and again without accounting for the soul.